Good evening. Sure is good to be in God's house tonight. Thank you for all for being here. We're going to be in Matthew 27 tonight. I don't think that I'm going to teach any of you anything tonight. I do hope that what I'll say will make you think. Yeah. So Matthew 27 tonight. While you're turning there, I would like to ask you a question. When's the last time that you experienced something that made you question or reevaluate everything that you knew about a subject? Sort of mind-blown experience, if you will. Perhaps you saw something, heard something, felt something, or perhaps you learned even the most minuscule fact that made you question everything. Maybe it even happened to you in this very room. As children, this can happen almost daily. We're constantly taking in new information about the world around us. But as we become older, we begin to think that we know how things work, and we can fail to look at our lives objectively, causing us to miss out on opportunities to look at things in a new light, a new way. Who knows, it may even change your life forever. It did for me. Starting in verse 26, then released he Barabbas unto them, talking about Pilate. And when he had scourged Jesus, let's stop there for a second. This scourging, now I'm sure most of you know this, and it is a bit graphic, but it's not gore for gore's sake. It does bear relevance to this, to the message here. Early historians assert that scourging was the most dreaded punishment, that bits of lead and stone were fastened to the end of a whip, or in this case, a cat o' nine tails, which made it a brutal, slashing instrument of terror, ripping a man's back and legs to shreds, occasionally even tearing out an eye or slicing open an ear. Think about it, it's not a precision weapon or a precision device. It's just swinging it. And the more you swing it, the more that arm's going to get tired, the more accidents that are going to happen. To get a cut or a scrape is one thing, but to have your flesh ripped is something else altogether. Getting a cut stings, but if you've ever ripped your flesh, you know that it stings and burns, and the pain pulses with your heartbeat, which might be slightly elevated if you were in the middle of getting scourged. This would have been an all-over brutal experience. We'll continue in verse 26. And when he had scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the common hall and gathered unto him the whole band of soldiers. So now picture this. They bring him into the common hall, an area designated for anyone with access to gather in. In the military, we had these. They were filled with like ping pong and pool tables and TVs. It's basically anybody, carte blanche, have a good time in there, right? And then it says that they gathered, it's pretty much a public place. And it says they called the whole band of soldiers in to witness what was about to happen. From what I can find, this could be a couple hundred up to 600 people. So packed house. Continuing in 28, and they stripped him and put on him a scarlet robe. And when they had plaited a crown of thorns, they put it upon his head, and a reed in his right hand. This would have been to mimic a scepter, which most kings would have carried in that day. And they bowed the knee before him and mocked him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews. And they spit upon him and took the reed and smote him in the head. This is to say that they hit him in the head with the reed, forcing the thorns of the crown deeper and deeper into his skin. This would have caused an alarming amount of blood to stream down his face and the back of his head. While not usually fatal, even a small wound to the face or scalp will cause what seems like a lot of bleeding due to the many surface-level blood vessels. I don't know if it's like this for anyone else, but when I've been hit hard in the head, there's this flash of white that you see. It almost blanks everything out. And then there's an instance of panic while the brain is trying to assess what is going on, almost like an alarm's going off. And then the pain of the hit sets in. This would have been a very unpleasant, to say the least, experience, having this happen time and time again. Continuing in verse 31, and after they had mocked him, they took the robe off from him and put his own raiment on him and led him away to crucify him. Imagine the humiliation, the mocking, the brutality of it all. Not only those inflicting the punishment, but the hundreds around screaming and laughing. I started off by asking you, when was the last time you experienced something that caused you to question everything you know about something? Excuse me. For me, this happened on July 4th, 2021. I was on vacation. I was visiting my brother and his family who had recently moved to Texas. I remember they invited me to church. I'm not sure if they thought it would make a difference, as they had invited me before with no avail. But it is the Christian thing to do. You see, back then, the last place you'd find me was in a church. I had actually thought of going to morning services, but I had gone for a run that morning, and that day was especially muggy. If you know July in Texas, you know what I'm talking about. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Is that better? Okay. If you know anything about the Texas heat in July, you know that it's pretty muggy. Uh, and sorry, I lost my place, Miss Joe. Uh, and I had not adapted to the Texas heat yet. Anyway, by the time they were leaving for church, I was still laying in their kitchen floor, sweating my brains out. The rest of the day was pretty uneventful, most relaxing, except it was the 4th of July, and my nephew is a firework fanatic, and he was gearing up to put on a stellar show that night at the church property after evening services, and it was a pretty good show, I'm not going to lie. I decided to go to services that evening just to make it easier on everyone vehicle-wise. I had planned on just getting through the service to get to the good stuff after. Little did I know this decision to attend services would change everything. 1 Corinthians 13:13 says, "And now abideth faith, hope, charity, these three, but the greatest of these is charity," talking about the spiritual gifts given to the members of the Lord's New Testament churches. Charity is what I experienced that night. The love of this church is something that I had never experienced. It caused me to objectively look at my life and reevaluate what exactly love means to me. Does anyone remember the message that we had on that 4th of July? It was a testimony service. I've talked to our pastor about that night before. The pastor and I got to take a mission trip to deliver goods to the seminary. It was me, the pastor, and Brother Jim. We got to take a missionary trip to deliver goods to the seminary and the logistics mission out east. What a blessing doing the Lord's work with that man. If you ever get a chance, take it. As my niece would say, highly recommend, 10 out of 10. I know he knows I was in town. I had met him the previous week prior to these services. We were riding dirt bikes, me, my brother, and my nephew, and the nieces. We're all out back on the property riding dirt bikes and quads, and our pastor was out there changing his oil. And so I got to shake his hand and meet him. I don't think there was any way that he could have known that I would show up that night. He said that he went back and forth on whether to do the testimony service that night. I'll tell you that if a different message gets preached that night, I may not be here now. But I firmly believe that the Holy Spirit worked through our pastor and convicted his heart and mine as well that night. As you all were sharing your testimony, the Holy Spirit was back in those pews giving me a good once-over. After services was a great time of fellowship where the members of the church exercised their spiritual gift effortlessly. I say effortlessly, it seemed effortlessly, like they didn't have to try to love. They did not turn up their nose at me, as I somewhat expected, but rather engaged me in conversation and displayed that something else Brother Mike likes to talk about in Sunday school. I started reading the Word, and I eventually got saved and became a member here, and it's all because of the charity I felt here. But that love had burrowed into my brain, and it made me question what it was I knew. I couldn't get away from it. It invaded my workouts, my work life. I would find myself daydreaming during TV about what it meant to me. I rather like what John had to say about love. In 1 John 3:18 says, "My little children, let us not love in word, neither in tongue, but in deed and in truth." Love is an action word, as in to love. John is saying here to show your love. Don't talk about it, be about it. Have any of you ever been told by someone that you were loved, but you knew deep down they didn't love you? Have any of you said, "I love you" to someone and gotten an empty "I love you" back? Or an "I love you" from someone that thinks that they love you, but their actions prove otherwise? It takes an objective look and some maturity in the matter to rightly discern the truth. I say some maturity because if a parent gives a child everything they want with no structure, instruction, or discipline in their life, with ice cream for breakfast and cake for dinner, the child may think that the parent loves them, but the opposite is in fact true. It is the parent that gives the child structure, instruction, and discipline when needed that truly loves their child. Proverb 13:24 says, "He that spareth the rod hateth his son, but he that loveth him chasteneth him betimes." Bob Marley once said, "You say you love the rain, but you use an umbrella to walk under it. You say you love the sun, but you seek shelter when it's shining. You say you love the wind, but when it comes, you close your windows. So that's why I'm scared when you say you love me." On the other hand, have you ever noticed that someone loves you without them saying? How did you notice it? Was it something you saw, something they did? Is it a feeling, something in their presence? When we pay attention to what exactly it is that led us to that conclusion, it makes it easier to tell when others love us, and perhaps even better when others don't. Don't sit around waiting for others to tell you that they love you, to realize that they do. And don't wait to tell those around you that you love them. I feel it's somewhat incomplete to say, "I love you," though, although it does feel good to hear, and I dare the gentleman here to respond with, "Sounds great," next time your wife says, "I love you." See how far you get. But I believe it would be more apt to ask, "Do I love you, or are you loved?" Because as our pastor has said, love is a choice, but also is receiving that love. I then started thinking about the different kinds of love. I'm sure you have heard our pastor talk about the words that the Greeks used for love. They broke it down into 3 areas: agape, a God-like love, giving of one's own life, think Jesus on the cross. Phileo, brotherly love. It seems like they lumped a lot into this category. And eros, passion, romantic, physical, reserved in the Bible mostly for married couples. I think within these 3, there are so many different subcategories. For instance, I love cheesecake and I love playing golf. Pretty great times. But these are the loves of inanimate objects and activities. This type of love differs from, say, the love of our fellow humans, our neighbors, showing compassion and empathy, or the love of an uncle differs from the love of an aunt, would be different for their niece or their nephew. The love of a brother or a sister, or whether it's for a brother or a sister. The love of a father differs from the love of a mother. The love of a son differs from the love of a daughter. And the love of a husband versus the love of a wife. There's an old saying, "Women, if you want to love your husband, respect him. Men, if you want to respect your wife, love her." Does anyone know how old this saying is? Pretty old. Ephesians 5:22, "Wives, submit yourselves unto your husbands as unto the Lord." And 5:25, "Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it." Or the love of the church members. What about the love of the pastor for his flock is different from the love of the flock for the pastor. And receiving that love of the church versus becoming a member and becoming a part of that love. There are a couple things missing from this list of love, though. There are loves that we are commanded to love. Matthew 22:36-39 reads, "Master, which is the great commandment in the law?" Jesus said unto him, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and all thy soul, and all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like unto it, Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." Did anyone catch that? I think that it's often overlooked, especially today. It says, "as thyself." I think we are commanded to love ourselves here. Are you tricking yourself into thinking that you love yourself? Are you a parent giving the child whatever it wants? Are you sparing yourself the rod? I was. I did. I didn't love myself for a long time. I definitely tried to fool myself into thinking I did. But then I met a man named Jesus, and he helped me to love me. There is still a love unlike any other, a perfect love, a love incorruptible, infallible, and infinite, that brings us back to today's text in Matthew 27. You may be saying, "We get it, Brother Spence. Jesus is beaten, and his flesh was ripped, and his body was ripped from his body, and he was spit on, and he was mocked and humiliated, and then he was crucified for us." We've heard it 1,000 times. Yes, that's all true. But to me, that's not what makes his love perfect. I want you to think about I want you to think about it. This should be especially easy for the parents here. Think about how you love most. Don't look directly at them or else everybody else will know. To save them, would you take a beating? Would you suffer public humiliation? How many of us suffer public humiliation at a job to put food on the table? Would you sit through being spit on? Would you wear the crown of thorns? Having it beat into your head, blood blinding your eyes, all the while you're being mocked? Now this is where it gets a bit harder. Would you try to suffer through having the flesh ripped from your back? Would you lay down your life? I don't think that you would find a parent that would be like, nope, I'm going to let my kid take that. We're not perfect. Our love is not perfect. So that's not what makes Jesus, to me, that's not what makes Jesus' love perfect here. Now think about someone that you kind of like. Would you be able to do it for them? What about a stranger? Would you do all that for a stranger? There would be far less people willing to go through all that for a stranger, but I would argue that it's not impossible to find someone that would. God did see fit to stock this world with some real heroes. We've heard of firefighters dying in blazes and our service members dying in defense of this country full of strangers. So no, not impossible. What about someone that rejects your love? What about the person that knows that you're doing that all for them and they still don't accept it? Would you still go through it all? Now we're getting a little closer to perfect, but I still don't think that we're quite there. What about the person beating you? The people spitting on you? For the man that made the crown? The one that placed it on your head? The one that beat it down? Making the blood flow like a river, stinging your eyes? For the ones humiliating you, mocking you? Would you go through all that to save the ones that are doing it to you? But still to me, this is not what makes his love perfect. What does it for me is that it is unchanging. It does not differ. His love for me is the same for you, is the same for all of his disciples and the unbelievers, the Jews and the Gentiles, the persecutor and the persecuted, the rich and the poor, the old and the young, the male and the female. Even the men that did these horrible things to our Redeemer have the same chance at salvation as we do. If they would have but repented, Jesus would have claimed them as his own. How then can I ever repay that love? Short answer is I can't. But I can choose to love Jesus. How do I show him I love him? Well, he told me where to start in John 14:15, where he said, if you love me, keep my commandments. But what else can I do? I can talk to him. I can invite him into my life. I can offer him a seat, let him chill, kick his feet up, make himself at home. Would he want to sit and hang out with me? Does he want to watch what I'm watching or listen what I'm listening to? I don't think he wants to hang out with me if he doesn't approve of what I'm consuming. Would you want to hang out with me if you didn't approve of what I was doing? People say make time for Jesus, set aside time for Jesus. Did you pray to Jesus? If I live my life so that Jesus is always hanging out with me and I'm constantly talking to him, there is no making time for Jesus. Earlier, I asked you to think of who you love most. Well, who do I love most? I try to follow the great commandment, but sometimes I wonder, how far down that list is Jesus? How far down that list am I? I've heard this question posed by our pastor, just worded slightly different. If I was accused and put on trial for loving Jesus, would there be enough evidence to convict me? Would there be enough evidence to convict me of loving you all here tonight? I'll end tonight by saying that I am eternally grateful. I'm grateful for the love of my brother and his wife for continually praying for me and inviting me to services. I'm grateful for the love of this church and what a blessing it has been to now be a part of that love. And I'm grateful for the love of Jesus Christ. Because of him and him alone, my sin debt is paid in full, and he will 100% do the same thing for you. That's it. Does anybody have anything to say? Awesome. Mm. I'm always coming in through the side door. So, yeah, I get that. So people will be like, oh, I thought about it this way. And I'm always like, that's weird. I thought about it like this. And I've even had conversations with our pastor after services. And I'm like, you said this. And like immediately my mind was like, oh man, that's like not where I was thinking at all. But it makes sense to me. I love you guys.